August 14th, 1944. Chartres, France, 17 kilometers southwest of the cathedral spires. Obergefreiter Klaus Dörr pressed his eye against the rubber cup of the Zeiss rangefinder and swept the western horizon, searching the haze where summer wheat met sky. The metal was already hot against his face despite the early hour, 7:43 in the morning. Behind him, the 4 barrels of the Flak 38 pointed uselessly at empty air, their 20mm bores still cool, still clean, still waiting. Dörr was 19 years old. He had been operating anti-aircraft guns for 11 months. He had fired at enemy aircraft 47 times. He had never shot one down. The sound reached him before the visual contact, not the growl of Merlin engines that announced British fighters, but something deeper, rougher, a sound like industrial machinery tearing through atmosphere. American radial engines, multiple contact, coming low, very low. Achtung! The word came from his throat before conscious thought. His crew, 3 other men younger than himself, scrambled to their positions. Helmut at the left gun, Franz at the right, Otto already cranking the hand wheel that traversed the quad mount toward the sound. Through the rangefinder, Dörr finally saw them. 4 dark shapes skimming the wheat, throwing up dust, coming straight down the farm road at what seemed impossible speed. P-47 Thunderbolts, American fighter bombers, Republic Aviation's answer to Germany's question about tactical air superiority. The rangefinder told him they were 4,000 meters out. At their current speed, somewhere between 600 and 700 kilometers per hour at this altitude, Dörr's brain performed calculations that had been drilled into him at the Luftwaffe Flak school in Peenemünde, 4,000 meters. Closing speed. Time to effective firing range for his guns, approximately 1,200 meters. Time remaining, approximately 20 seconds. But the Americans wouldn't wait until 1,200 meters. Their Browning M2 machine guns, 8 of them per aircraft, 4 in each wing, had effective range exceeding 2,000 meters against ground targets. The pilots would open fire at approximately 1,600 meters to ensure saturation. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Dörr did the mathematics again, faster this time, with the particular clarity that comes when a human being realizes he has only seconds to live. Current range, 3,800 meters. American effective firing range, 1,600 meters. Difference, 2,200 meters. Closing speed, approximately 185 meters per second. 2,200 divided by 185, 11.8 seconds, call it 12. 12 seconds until 32 Browning machine guns, firing at a combined rate of nearly 8,000 rounds per minute, turned his position into shredded metal and meat. But Dörr also knew something else, something the Americans perhaps didn't consider as they dove toward his position with absolute confidence in their firepower superiority. His Flak Vierling, firing all 4 barrels, could put out 800 rounds per minute of 20mm high-explosive ammunition. Not nearly the volume of fire coming at him, but each of his rounds, if it connected, would do catastrophic damage to an aircraft. A single 20mm shell could sever control cables, rupture fuel lines, kill a pilot outright. The question, the terrible mathematical question that every German flak gunner in France understood by August of 1944, was simple. Could he get his guns on target and firing before the Americans opened fire? And if he did, could he hit anything in the 4, maybe 5 seconds he would have before the incoming fire either killed him or forced him to take cover? The rangefinder showed 3,200 meters now. The P-47 seconds grew larger, their forms resolving from dark shapes into distinct aircraft. Dörr could see the invasion stripes, the white bands painted around wings and fuselage, the mark of Allied aircraft operating over France after D-Day. 2,800 meters. Otto was still cranking the traverse. Too slow, far too slow. "Manual traverse!" Dörr shouted, though the words were barely audible over the building roar of American engines. The crew grabbed the quad mount itself, physically forcing it around on its pedestal, muscles against metal, desperation against physics. 2,400 meters. The guns came to bear. Dörr dropped behind the sight, his hands finding the firing grips, his thumbs hovering over the triggers. The lead P-47 centered in his sight picture. He could see the pilot now, a figure in the cockpit, a human being like himself, also performing calculations, also measuring the closing distance, also preparing to kill. 20,000 meters. 1,600 meters. Dörr pressed the triggers. To understand what happened in that wheat field outside Chartres, to comprehend the mathematics of survival that Klaus Dörr calculated in his final seconds, requires understanding what the P-47 Thunderbolt represented in the summer of 1944. It was not merely an aircraft. It was industrial supremacy made physical, a 7-ton argument for American victory constructed from aluminum, steel, and absolute confidence in material abundance. Republic Aviation's P-47 Thunderbolt entered service with the United States Army Air Forces in November 1942. By August 1944, when Dörr watched 4 of them approach his position, over 15,000 had been built. The Republic factory in Farmingdale, New York, was producing them at a rate exceeding 500 per month. The Evansville, Indiana plant added hundreds more. By war's end, Republic would deliver 15,636 Thunderbolts, making it one of the most produced American fighters of the war. But production numbers alone don't explain what made the P-47 particularly lethal to ground targets like Dörr's Flak position. The Thunderbolt's primary armament consisted of 8 Browning A&M 250 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, loaded with belts of ammunition mixing armor-piercing incendiary, tracer, and ball rounds. Each gun fired at approximately 850 rounds per minute. Combined rate of fire from all 8 guns, approximately 6,800 rounds per minute, over 100 rounds per second. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The standard ammunition load for a P-47 varied by mission, but typically consisted of 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds total, weighing approximately 470 pounds. At full combat rate of fire, a Thunderbolt could expend its entire ammunition load in approximately 30 seconds of continuous firing. In practice, pilots fired in bursts of 2 to 3 seconds, conserving ammunition for multiple passes. The 50 caliber Browning M2, originally designed by John Browning in 1918 and refined throughout the interwar period, fired a half-inch diameter projectile weighing approximately 1.6 ounces at a muzzle velocity exceeding 2,900 feet per second. The armor-piercing incendiary variant, which comprised roughly 25% of a typical ammunition belt, could penetrate half an inch of armor plate at 500 yards. Against unarmored targets like Dörr's Flak position, which had at most a thin gun shield, the 50 caliber rounds were absolutely lethal. Effective range against ground targets exceeded 2,000 meters, though most P-47 pilots preferred to open fire between 1,200 and 1,600 meters during ground attack runs, allowing time for the stream of fire to walk onto target as the aircraft closed. At 1,600 meters, traveling at 600 kilometers per hour, a P-47 pilot had approximately 9 seconds until overflying the target, 9 seconds to acquire, fire, observe hits, and pull up to avoid ground collision or flying through his own bullet impacts. From the German Flak gunner's perspective, those same 9 seconds represented the entire engagement window. The mathematical reality was unforgiving. A Flak 38 quad mount, operated by a well-trained crew, required approximately 8 to 12 seconds to traverse 90 degrees and acquire a fast-moving target. The guns themselves had an effective horizontal range of approximately 2,000 meters, maximum range of nearly 5,000 meters, but practical combat effectiveness against fast-moving aircraft peaked at 1,200 to 1,500 meters. This created what German Flak training manuals, issued by the Luftwaffe in 1943, coldly described as disadvantageous engagement geometry. By the time a Flak crew detected approaching fighter bombers, traversed their guns onto target, and opened fire, American pilots were already within their own effective firing range. The Flak crew might achieve 4 to 6 seconds of firing opportunity before incoming fire forced them to cease fire and seek cover, or more likely, killed them outright. Klaus Dörr's Flak 38 represented Germany's attempt to solve an impossible problem: how to defend ground forces and installations against an enemy who owned the sky through material superiority so complete that tactical innovation became irrelevant. The Flak, whose designation translated simply as Anti-Aircraft Quadruplet 38, entered Luftwaffe service in 1941, designed specifically for low-altitude air defense. The system mounted 4 Flak 38 20mm automatic cannons on a single pedestal mount, allowing one gunner to direct all 4 weapons simultaneously. Combined rate of fire, approximately 800 rounds per minute, or 3,200 rounds per minute theoretical maximum if all 4 guns fired without stoppage. In practice, stoppages were common, reducing effective rate closer to 600 to 700 rounds per minute combined. Each 20mm round, either high explosive or armor-piercing, weighed approximately 4.2 ounces. Muzzle velocity, approximately 2,950 feet per second, comparable to the American .50 caliber. But the 20mm shell carried significantly more explosive content. A direct hit could be catastrophic to an aircraft. The problem was achieving that hit. The Flakvierling's crew typically consisted of 4 men: a commander who operated the rangefinder and directed fire, a gunner who aimed and fired the weapons, and 2 loaders who fed ammunition belts into the 4 guns. In practice, by August 1944, many Flak crews operated with only 3 men due to casualties and manpower shortages. Some positions were manned by only 2, with the commander serving as gunner. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Training for Flakvierling crews had once been rigorous. Before 1943, Luftwaffe Flak training lasted 12 to 16 weeks, including extensive practice against towed aerial targets. Recruits learned to calculate lead angles for crossing targets, to estimate altitude and speed by eye, to coordinate as teams where individual gun discipline meant the difference between effective fire and wasted ammunition. By 1944, that training had collapsed along with most of German military instruction. The replacement crews arriving at Flak positions in France received perhaps 4 to 6 weeks of abbreviated training. Some received less. The Wehrmacht's desperate need for anti-aircraft gunners to defend against Allied air supremacy meant that men were being pushed into positions with minimal preparation. More disturbing, by the summer of 1944, many German Flak positions were no longer manned by Luftwaffe regulars at all. The Luftwaffenhelfer program, instituted in January 1943, conscripted 15 to 17-year-old boys directly from gymnasium secondary schools into Flak service. These children, for that is what they were, received abbreviated training before assignment to operational batteries. By mid-1944, thousands of German Flak guns defending the Reich and occupied territories were operated primarily by teenagers. Whether Klaus Dörr's crew outside Chartres included Luftwaffenhelfer remains unknown. What is documented is that by August 1944, German Flak effectiveness had declined precipitously. The Luftwaffe's own after-action reports, compiled from surviving Flak batteries, indicated hit ratios that had fallen to approximately 1 enemy aircraft destroyed per 15,000 rounds fired. Some units reported worse ratios. The mathematics of attrition were crushing. Germany's industrial capacity could not replace ammunition, guns, or trained crews at rates matching their consumption. Supply shortages compounded the problem. Ammunition rationing meant many Flak positions operated under standing orders to hold fire except against targets of opportunity, defined as enemy aircraft clearly within effective range and presenting favorable engagement geometry. Opening fire prematurely merely revealed the position to enemy pilots while wasting irreplaceable ammunition. This created a terrible psychological trap for German Flak crews. They were ordered to wait until enemy aircraft came well within range before firing, maximizing hit probability. But waiting also meant the enemy aircraft were within their own firing range, ensuring that German gun crews would be exposed to suppressive fire the moment they opened fire themselves. The doctrine essentially mandated that flak crews accept casualties in exchange for the possibility of achieving hits. Klaus Dörr received his flakvierling training at the Luftwaffe Flak School in Peenemünde on Germany's Baltic coast, beginning in September 1943. The facility, more famous for its rocket research under Wernher von Braun, also housed extensive anti-aircraft training grounds, where thousands of young men learned to operate the weapons that were supposed to defend the Reich from aerial devastation. The training syllabus, preserved in Luftwaffe archives, reveals a doctrine built on assumptions that had already become obsolete by the time Dörr arrived. The manual, Ausbildungsvorschrift für Flakartillerie, training regulation for flak artillery, assumed German crews would engage enemy aircraft operating at medium to high altitude, between 1,500 and 4,000 meters, where the flakvierling's ballistic characteristics offered reasonable hit probability against bombers, maintaining steady courses. But by late 1943, Allied tactical doctrine had shifted dramatically. American and British fighter bombers increasingly operated at extremely low altitude, sometimes below 100 meters, using terrain masking and high speed to minimize exposure to flak fire. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its rugged construction and powerful Pratt & Whitney R2000 800 radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, excelled at this role. Pilots could dive to treetop level, deliver rockets or bombs, and climb away before flak crews could effectively engage. Dörr's training included 6 weeks of classroom instruction on ballistics, aircraft recognition, and fire control procedures, followed by 4 weeks of live fire exercises using towed aerial targets. The targets, typically fabric sleeves towed behind Ju-52 transport aircraft, moved at approximately 250 km per hour at altitudes between 1,000 and 2,000 meters. The trainees learned to calculate lead angles, to estimate range using the rangefinder's graduated scales, to fire in controlled bursts rather than continuous streams that would burn out gun barrels. What the training did not adequately prepare them for was the psychological reality of engaging an aircraft, diving directly at their position at 600 km per hour or more, with 8 machine guns firing back. The towed targets didn't shoot. The towed targets didn't leave smoking craters where flak positions used to be. The towed targets represented a sanitized version of combat that bore almost no resemblance to what Dörr would face in France. The Luftwaffe understood this gap between training and reality. Internal memoranda from 1944, discovered in post-war archives, acknowledged that flak crew casualties had reached unsustainable levels. In some sectors, life expectancy for flakvierling crews engaging Allied fighter bombers was measured in weeks, not months. The 9th Air Force, operating in support of Allied ground forces after D-Day, flew thousands of sorties monthly against German ground positions. Each sortie represented potential annihilation for the flak crews below. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the time Dörr deployed to France in March 1944, 3 months before the Allied invasion, he had fired approximately 800 practice rounds. He had never engaged an actual enemy aircraft. His crew, assembled from various replacement pools, had trained together for exactly 11 days before deployment. Helmut, the youngest at 17, had received only 4 weeks of abbreviated training. Franz and Otto, both 18, had slightly more experience, but had never fired at anything except towed targets. Their flakvierling position outside Chartres was one of dozens scattered along major roads and near critical infrastructure, positioned to provide point defense against Allied fighter-bomber attacks. The position itself consisted of the quad-mount gun on its pedestal, a small dugout shelter for the crew, and approximately 3,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition stored in wooden crates under camouflage netting. No early warning radar, no networked fire control, no fighter cover. German air superiority over France, which had once been absolute, had evaporated. The Luftwaffe fighter squadrons that might have intercepted Allied fighter bombers were either destroyed, withdrawn to defend Germany itself, or grounded by fuel shortages. Flak crews like Dörr's represented virtually the only defense against aircraft that roamed French skies at will. The tactical situation reports Dörr's battery commander received painted a picture of systematic destruction. Allied fighter bombers were methodically destroying German transportation networks, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, troop concentrations, and flak positions. The reports included estimated American sortie rates, which staggered belief, sometimes 500 or more fighter-bomber missions per day in the 9th Air Force's operational area alone. Against this onslaught, Dörr's position had orders that reflected desperation rather than doctrine. Engage any enemy aircraft approaching within effective range, prioritize aircraft clearly attacking ground forces or infrastructure, conserve ammunition except when target destruction probability exceeded 50%. That final order, conserve ammunition, meant Dörr was supposed to perform probability calculations while watching P-47 seconds dive toward his position. He was supposed to determine, in seconds, whether opening fire offered better than even odds of hitting the target. If not, he was to hold fire, let the aircraft pass, preserve ammunition for better opportunities. The order was militarily rational and psychologically impossible. No human being with a loaded weapon watches death approach and rationally calculates probability of success before defending himself. At 2,000 meters, Klaus Dörr pressed the triggers. The Flak-Vierling's 4 barrels erupted simultaneously, their combined recoil transmitted through the mount into the ground, through Dörr's hands, into his shoulders, his skeleton, his teeth. The sound was catastrophic, a rapid hammering that obliterated all other sensation. 20mm shells, each round costing the Reich 1.7 Reichsmarks at 1944 prices, streaked toward the approaching P-47 seconds at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Dörr held the triggers down for 3 seconds. Approximately 40 rounds total, 10 from each barrel, arcing across 2,000 meters of French morning air toward 4 aircraft that had not yet reacted to his fire. The tracers, every 5th round, drew lines of light that seemed to curve impossibly upward before dropping toward the targets. Ballistic trajectory, gravity asserting itself even on objects moving at supersonic velocity. The lead P-47 did not explode, did not break apart, did not deviate from its course. Dörr's fire, all 40 rounds, passed somewhere near the aircraft, perhaps above, perhaps behind, the exact miss distance unknowable. At 2,000 meters, with targets moving at 650 kilometers per hour, even a slight error in lead calculation meant complete miss. 1,800 meters now. Dörr pressed the triggers again. Another 3-second burst, another 40 rounds. 40 more Reichsmarks of diminishing German industrial capacity hurled uselessly at American aluminum and steel. The second burst also missed, possibly closer, impossible to tell. 1,600 meters. The lead P-47's wings lit up. Not fire, not damage, but muzzle flash. 8 Browning machine guns beginning their work. The pilot had opened fire at exactly the range Dörr's calculations predicted. And unlike Dörr's 20mm rounds, fired by a gunner whose hands were shaking, whose heart was hammering, whose training had prepared him for towed targets rather than this, the American rounds were fired by a pilot who had done this before, many times, who understood the mathematics of aerial gunnery not from classroom instruction but from successful kills. The sound reached Dörr perhaps half a second after the visual contact, not the sharp crack of his own guns but something else, a deeper tearing sound, like fabric ripping but amplified, multiplied, sustained. 100 rounds per second crossing 1,600 meters in approximately 3 seconds, 300 rounds inbound. The American pilot's first burst hit the ground 30 meters short of Dörr's position. Geysers of dirt erupted in a line walking toward the Flak-Vierling. Not wild spray, but controlled fire, the pilot correcting his aim as the aircraft closed. The rounds that hit Earth were half-inch diameter projectiles, carrying enough kinetic energy to penetrate 18 inches of soft ground. The rounds that hit Dörr's gun shield were armor-piercing incendiary types that punched through quarter-inch steel as if it were paper. Helmut, standing to Dörr's left, simply ceased to exist as a recognizable human being. One moment he was there, hands on the left gun's loading mechanism. The next moment he was gone, replaced by something that had been rendered into component parts too quickly for the eye to process. 2 50 caliber rounds, perhaps 3, had struck him center mass, at close range. The hydrostatic shock alone was lethal. The actual tissue damage was catastrophic beyond medical description. Dörr threw himself sideways, abandoning the gun, abandoning training, abandoning everything except the primal imperative to escape the stream of fire that was methodically destroying his position. He hit the ground and rolled toward the dugout shelter, 4 meters away, 4 meters that might as well have been 4 kilometers. The P-47 was directly overhead now, its engine sound overwhelming, its propeller wash creating a hurricane of dust and torn vegetation. The pilot was no longer firing, no need. The target was suppressed, neutralized, effectively destroyed. The aircraft pulled up sharply, climbing away, its engine note changing as the pilot added power. But there were 3 more aircraft. The second P-47 arrived exactly 12 seconds after the first, following the same attack geometry, its guns already firing at a target that had already been destroyed but might still contain living defenders capable of shooting back. Another 3-second burst. Another 300 rounds. The ammunition crates exploded as incendiary rounds found them, 20mm high-explosive shells, detonating in sympathetic chains that threw shrapnel in all directions. Dörr, pressed flat in the dugout, felt something hot tear through his left shoulder. Not pain, not yet, just pressure and heat. He tried to move and discovered his arm wouldn't respond correctly. Shrapnel, from his own ammunition. He was being wounded by German explosives detonated by American bullets. The third and fourth P-47 seconds didn't fire. They pulled up and circled, their pilots apparently satisfied that the position was thoroughly destroyed, no longer a threat, not worth additional ammunition expenditure. Through the ringing in his ears, Dörr heard their engines fading, moving on to other targets, other roads, other desperate gun crews waiting with insufficient weapons and inadequate training. The entire engagement, from first trigger press to last departing engine sound, had lasted approximately 42 seconds. Silence returned slowly, built from layers of absence. First the absence of machine gun fire, then the absence of aircraft engines, finally the absence of secondary explosions as the last ammunition finished detonating. What remained was the sound of fire, the particular crackling of equipment burning, and something else that Dörr's mind refused initially to process. Human sounds, moaning, sobbing, the wet breathing of punctured lungs. Franz was alive but would not remain so. Dörr could see him from the dugout, sprawled beside the destroyed Flak, his torso opened by something that had struck with enough force to separate ribs from sternum. The human body, Dörr understood in that moment, is mostly water contained in fragile membranes. 50 caliber rounds and 20mm shrapnel create pressure waves that rupture those membranes catastrophically. Franz had perhaps 2 minutes of consciousness remaining, perhaps less. Otto was sitting upright, which seemed promising, until Dörr realized he was sitting upright because he had been thrown against the ammunition storage pit's concrete wall with enough force to wedge him into position. His eyes were open. He was not breathing. His neck was clearly broken, his head canted at an angle that should not be anatomically possible. Helmut remained unaccounted for, which meant Helmut no longer existed in any form requiring accounting. 4 men, 4 German soldiers, 3 of them teenagers, one of them 19 years old with 11 months of training and experience. They had engaged 4 P-47 Thunderbolts for approximately 42 seconds. They had fired perhaps 120 rounds of 20mm ammunition, costing the Reich approximately 204 Reichsmarks, roughly equivalent to 6 weeks' salary for an industrial worker in 1944 Germany. In exchange for this expenditure, they had achieved exactly 0 hits on enemy aircraft, 0 damage to enemy equipment, 0 disruption of enemy operations. The P-47 seconds had continued to their next target without meaningful delay. The cost to the Reich, 1 Flak 38 completely destroyed, value approximately 45,000 Reichsmarks, approximately 3,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition destroyed, value approximately 5,100 Reichsmarks, 4 men killed or fatally wounded, 3 of them essentially children. One of them, Dörr himself, though he did not yet understand this. The shrapnel wound in his shoulder, which still produced no pain, only spreading numbness, had severed his subclavian artery. He was bleeding internally at a rate that would produce unconsciousness within approximately 8 minutes, death within 12. In a field hospital with surgical capability, he might have survived, but the nearest German field hospital was 30 kilometers east, and German medical transport had essentially ceased to exist in France by August 1944. Allied fighter bombers had destroyed most ambulances, most medical vehicles, most anything that moved on French roads in daylight. Dörr attempted to stand and discovered his legs would not support him. The blood loss was already affecting his brain, his muscles, his capacity for coordinated movement. He remained in the dugout, leaning against sandbags, watching Franz's breathing become shallower, more irregular, finally stop. The chronological details of the next hour remain unclear because Dörr's consciousness fragmented. What is known, documented in American 9th Air Force records, is that a second flight of P-47 seconds from the 362nd Fighter Group passed over the position approximately 50 minutes after the initial attack. The pilots noted the destroyed Flak position in their mission reports, confirming the kill, adding 1 more destroyed German anti-aircraft gun to the day's tally. What those pilots could not see from altitude was Klaus Dörr, still conscious, still bleeding, calculating with his final moments of clarity the mathematics that had killed him. He had pressed the triggers at 2,000 meters, closing speed approximately 185 meters per second. Time from his first shot to American first shot, approximately 8 seconds. Time from American first shot to position destruction, approximately 4 seconds. 12 seconds total, not 4. His mental calculation, performed while watching death approach, had been optimistic by 8 seconds. But those 8 seconds were largely irrelevant because even if he had opened fire earlier, even if his crew had been faster, more experienced, better trained, the outcome would have been identical. The mathematics were unforgiving. 8 50 caliber machine guns firing 100 rounds per second generated suppressive fire so overwhelming that accurate return fire became effectively impossible. German Flak doctrine, written by officers who had never faced P-47 seconds, assumed gun crews could maintain fire discipline under direct attack. That assumption was false. When 300 rounds per second impact your position, human nervous systems override training. Self-preservation overcomes doctrine. You stop firing, you seek cover, you die. Dörr understood, in his final minutes of consciousness, that the entire German Flak defense system in France was built on assumptions that material reality had rendered obsolete. German 20mm guns might theoretically be able to damage P-47 seconds, but theory required hitting the aircraft. Hitting required sustained accurate fire. Sustained accurate fire required crews who could function while being shot at by weapons that made sustained accurate fire impossible. The Americans had solved a military problem through industrial brute force. They had not developed better tactics or superior training. They had simply mounted so many guns on their aircraft, firing so many rounds, that German gun crews could not effectively return fire. Quantity had achieved what quality alone might not. 8 50 caliber guns were not 8 times better than 1. They were exponentially better because their combined fire created suppression that prevented effective counterfire. Klaus Dörr died approximately 90 minutes after the engagement, alone beside his destroyed gun, surrounded by his dead crew, his blood soaking into French soil that would be liberated by American ground forces within 3 weeks. His death was not recorded in any German unit records because his unit no longer effectively existed. His family in Bavaria received notification in October 1944 that he was missing, presumed killed in action. His mother received his final letter, written 2 days before his death, in December. In it, he described the weather in France, the quality of the food, his hope to return home for Christmas. He made no mention of being terrified. The destroyed Flak position outside Chartres represented one data point in a larger pattern of systematic annihilation that characterized the final year of German military resistance in Western Europe. Between June 6, 1944, D-Day, and May 8, 1945, VE Day, the United States 9th Air Force alone flew over 400,000 sorties in support of Allied ground operations. A substantial percentage targeted German anti-aircraft positions. The 9th Air Force's 362nd Fighter Group, operating P-47 Thunderbolts from forward airfields in France, maintained detailed records of flak suppression missions. These records, preserved in the National Archives, document the methodical destruction of German air defences throughout the summer and fall of 1944. The statistics are overwhelming in their clinical precision. August 1944, 1,247 flak positions engaged, 891 confirmed, destroyed, 312 damaged, 44 probable destroys. September, 1,450 Assengs engaged, 1,070 Sengs confirmed destroyed, 298 damaged, 6770 Sengs probable. October, 1.600 Super engaged, 1.203 confirmed destroyed, 300.6 damaged, 8.62.7, 8 probable. The numbers climbed monthly as German defensive positions multiplied in desperate attempts to slow Allied advance, only to be identified and destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The human cost embedded in these statistics remained largely invisible to American pilots conducting the attacks. From 1,500 meters altitude, traveling at 600 kilometers per hour, a destroyed flak position appeared as a brief flash, perhaps smoke, maybe secondary explosions if ammunition stores detonated. The men operating those guns, their ages, their training, their final seconds of consciousness, these details did not appear in mission reports. But German casualty records, fragmentary as they are for the war's final year, suggest the scale of losses among flak crews. The Luftwaffe's flak arm, which had numbered approximately 1.2 million personnel at its peak in 1943, suffered casualties exceeding 300,000 killed or permanently disabled by war's end. The majority of these losses occurred in 1944 and 45, as Allied air supremacy became absolute. Particularly devastating were casualties among the Luftwaffenhelfer, the teenage conscripts manning flak guns. Precise numbers remain disputed by historians, but conservative estimates place Luftwaffenhelfer deaths at between 10,000 and 15,000, with perhaps twice that number wounded. These were children, 15 to 17 years old, trained for weeks and thrown into combat against pilots who had been flying for years, operating aircraft representing the pinnacle of American industrial might. The survivors, those few flak crew members who lived through the final year of the war, carried psychological scars that post-war German society struggled to acknowledge. Unlike infantry veterans whose combat experiences fit established narratives of courage and sacrifice, flak crews had experienced industrialized slaughter from which there was no defense, no tactical response, no honorable death. They had simply died or survived through luck while being systematically erased by an enemy they rarely even hit. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, responded to mounting flak casualties with characteristic detachment from reality. In November 1944, he issued orders demanding improved flak crew performance, threatening court-martial for commanders whose units failed to achieve adequate kill ratios against Allied aircraft. The order made no acknowledgement of material realities, that German flak crews were undertrained, under-equipped, overwhelmingly outnumbered, and facing aircraft against which their weapons were marginally effective at best. The broader strategic implications of Allied air supremacy extended beyond simple target destruction. German military mobility in France effectively ceased during daylight hours by late summer 1944. Units attempting daytime movement on roads suffered such catastrophic casualties from fighter-bomber attacks that Wehrmacht commanders restricted troop movements to darkness. This tactical constraint, movement only at night, reduced German operational flexibility to near zero. Supply columns, fuel trucks, ammunition convoys, all the logistical apparatus that modern mechanized warfare requires, became priority targets for P-47 seconds and other Allied fighter bombers. The German Army Group B, defending northern France, reported in August 1944 that approximately 70% of its supply vehicles had been destroyed or abandoned. Units in contact with Allied ground forces were receiving perhaps 20% of required supplies. Starvation, ammunition shortages, and fuel exhaustion accomplished what direct combat sometimes could not. The systematic destruction of German anti-aircraft defences enabled this logistical strangulation. Each destroyed flak position meant Allied aircraft could operate more freely, could fly lower, could identify targets more easily, could attack with greater accuracy. The flak crews, dying in their positions, were not merely being killed, they were being erased as obstacles, removed from a battlefield where their presence had become irrelevant to the outcome. By December 1944, during the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, German flak effectiveness had deteriorated to near zero. Despite concentrating substantial anti-aircraft forces to support the offensive, German units achieved negligible success against Allied aircraft once weather cleared. American P-47 seconds operated with near impunity, destroying German armoured columns that had no effective air defence. The flak guns fired. The Americans flew through the fire, took losses they considered acceptable, and continued destroying targets. German flak had become merely a hazard, not a deterrent. The American pilots who destroyed Klaus Dörr's position, and thousands like it, operated within a military culture that understood air combat through radically different frameworks than their German opponents. American fighter-bomber pilots were not expected to achieve individual glory or demonstrate personal courage against overwhelming odds. They were expected to execute mission objectives efficiently, using superior equipment and numerical advantage to minimize risk while maximizing target destruction. This approach, fundamentally industrial rather than heroic, represented American military philosophy at its most characteristic. The United States did not attempt to produce superweapons or elite warrior castes. It produced overwhelming numbers of competent soldiers operating reliable equipment, supported by logistical networks that ensured they never lacked ammunition, fuel, or replacement aircraft. The P-47 pilots attacking German flak positions understood they possessed enormous advantages. Their aircraft could absorb significant damage and continue flying. The R-2800 radial engine, air-cooled and mechanically simple, could lose several cylinders to flak damage and still produce enough power to return to base. The aircraft's structural strength meant it could survive hits that would destroy lighter fighters. Pilots knew these facts and flew accordingly, with confidence born from material superiority. American fighter-bomber doctrine emphasized teamwork and mutual support over individual heroics. Flights of 4 aircraft attacked in coordinated sequence, each pilot covering the others, suppressing defenses, ensuring no single aircraft faced concentrated fire. The first aircraft drew fire and identified defensive positions. The second aircraft attacked those positions specifically. The third and fourth aircraft struck the primary target or provided additional suppression as needed. This tactical coordination, which became standard practice by mid-1944, made German flak defense even more difficult. A gun crew engaging the first aircraft would be destroyed by the second before they could shift fire. Attempting to ignore the first aircraft and wait for subsequent passes meant allowing free attack runs. There was no winning tactical response. American aircrew casualties, while significant in absolute numbers, remained proportionally low compared to targets destroyed. The 9th Air Force, during its 11 months of operations from D-Day to VE Day, lost approximately 400 P-47 seconds to all causes, including flak, enemy fighters, operational accidents, and mechanical failures. During the same period, the 9th Air Force flew over 400,000 sorties and destroyed or damaged tens of thousands of German vehicles, rail cars, buildings, and defensive positions. The mathematics were clear. America could afford its losses. Germany could not afford its losses. American aircraft production in 1944 exceeded 96,000 aircraft. German production reached approximately 40,000, and many of these were fighters designed for high-altitude interception of bombers, not ground attack or low-altitude combat. American pilot training programs graduated thousands of new pilots monthly. German training had collapsed under fuel shortages and Allied bombing of training facilities. But individual American pilots, despite their material advantages, still faced death in forms that training could not entirely prepare them for. Flak, even from outmatched German guns, remained lethal when it connected. A 20mm shell striking a P-47's cockpit would kill the pilot, as certainly as a 50-caliber round killed a German gunner. The aircraft's ruggedness protected pilots from near misses and glancing hits, but direct hits were still catastrophic. First Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a P-47 pilot with the 56th Fighter Group, survived a harrowing encounter with German flak and fighters in June 1943 that left his aircraft with more than 200 bullet and shell holes. His survival became legendary, used in training films and morale presentations to demonstrate the Thunderbolts' toughness. But Johnson's survival was partially luck. Other pilots, hit similarly, did not return. The psychological experience of American fighter-bomber pilots attacking German positions was fundamentally different from that of German flak crews defending them. American pilots chose their moment of engagement, attacked with initiative and surprise, and could break off if resistance proved too intense. German flak crews waited, reacted, and had no option to disengage. One side hunted, the other side was prey. Post-war interviews with American fighter-bomber pilots reveal complex attitudes toward the destruction they inflicted. Many expressed satisfaction at contributing to victory, pride in their unit's effectiveness, and relief at surviving. Some expressed regret or discomfort when discussing attacks on ground targets, particularly when those targets included personnel rather than vehicles or structures. The visual reality of men being torn apart by 50-caliber fire, even enemy men, sometimes haunted pilots decades later. But these regrets, when they occurred, were tempered by knowledge of German atrocities, by understanding that the men they killed were part of a military machine that had initiated aggressive war and committed systematic crimes. American pilots were not struggling with guilt over killing innocents. They had killed soldiers, enemy combatants, men who were actively shooting back. The moral calculus, while not simple, was clear enough to allow most pilots to reconcile their actions with their consciences. The technological and tactical lessons American forces learned from the flak suppression campaign informed post-war military aviation development. The value of rugged aircraft construction, heavy armament, and coordinated attack tactics became foundational principles for subsequent fighter-bomber designs. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, introduced in the 1970s, directly descended from lessons learned in P-47 operations, including emphasis on survivability, heavy gun armament, and close air support mission focus. The story of Klaus Dörr and his 4 seconds, his doomed calculation while watching death approach at 600 km per hour, encapsulates a broader truth about the Second World War's final phase. Germany lost not because German soldiers lacked courage or determination, but because material reality made courage and determination irrelevant. The mathematics were unforgiving. American industrial production in 1944 exceeded the combined output of Germany, Japan, and Italy. The United States produced more military aircraft in 1944 than Germany produced during the entire war. American aluminum production alone exceeded total German production of all metals. These disparities translated directly into battlefield outcomes. More aircraft meant more sorties. More sorties meant more targets destroyed. More destruction meant fewer German resources available for resistance. German flak crews like Dörr's represented the sharp end of this material imbalance. They operated weapons that were technically adequate but numerically insufficient, firing ammunition they could not waste against targets they could barely hit, trained inadequately for combat conditions that made adequate training impossible. Their courage was unquestionable. Their determination was absolute. Their effectiveness was near zero. The irony, the profound historical irony that makes this story worth examining 8 decades later, is that German military culture emphasized exactly the values that proved most useless in industrial total war: individual heroism, fighting spirit, willingness to die for honor. These concepts that had defined military excellence for millennia became liabilities when facing an enemy who simply produced more guns, more ammunition, more aircraft, more everything. American military culture, often dismissed by German officers as pedestrian or uncreative, proved devastatingly effective precisely because it prioritized industrial efficiency over martial glory. Americans did not expect their soldiers to fight to the death. They expected their soldiers to use superior equipment and numerical advantage to achieve objectives with minimal casualties. This approach, fundamentally managerial rather than heroic, won the war. The flak crews died defending a cause that was already lost, not because they failed in their duty, but because their duty was impossible. No amount of courage could overcome 8 50-caliber machine guns firing in coordinated bursts. No determination could make 20mm shells magically accurate against targets moving at 650 kilometers per hour. No training could prepare 18-year-olds to function while being shot at by weapons specifically designed to prevent function. Post-war German veterans, including surviving flak crew members, struggled with this reality. Their military culture had taught them that defeat came from insufficient will, from failure of spirit, from betrayal or weakness. But the men who had manned flak guns in France knew differently. They had not lacked will. They had not been cowards. They had simply been ground under by material superiority so complete that individual performance became meaningless. This realization, that courage and determination were insufficient, that they had been sacrificed not through their own failures but through systematic disadvantage, and produced psychological wounds that never fully healed. Unlike soldiers who could tell themselves they had fought well, that they had done their duty and lost honorably, flak crew survivors knew they had been erased, removed from the battlefield not through superior enemy courage, but through superior enemy production capacity. The teenagers who survived, the Luftwaffenhelfer who somehow lived through 1944 and 45, carried these experiences into post-war German society. Many struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some refused to discuss their service. Others spoke obsessively about it, trying to make sense of experiences that defied rational explanation. How do you explain watching your friends disintegrate under 50-caliber fire? How do you explain surviving when survival was purely random? The broader historical lesson extends beyond the specific tactical situation of flak crews versus P-47 seconds. The Second World War demonstrated conclusively that modern industrial warfare favors nations capable of mobilizing vast resources over nations dependent on tactical excellence or warrior spirit. Germany's military tradition, built on centuries of European warfare where skill and courage often determined outcomes, proved obsolete against American industrial capacity. This lesson remains relevant. Military conflicts in the 79 years since 1945 have repeatedly confirmed that material superiority, particularly technological and logistical superiority, trumps determination and fighting spirit. The conflicts where this proved less true, Vietnam, Afghanistan, were asymmetric wars against insurgencies, not conventional military contests between industrial powers. Klaus Dörr died in a conventional military contest between industrial powers. He died knowing, in his final conscious moments, that the contest was unfair, that he had been assigned an impossible task, that his death would accomplish nothing. He died anyway, because duty and training and circumstance gave him no alternative. His death was not heroic in any traditional sense. It was simply the inevitable outcome of mathematics. Insufficient firepower versus overwhelming firepower, inadequate numbers versus crushing numbers, individual courage versus industrial capacity. The 4 seconds he calculated, the brief window between when he could first fire effectively and when American guns would suppress his position, represented the entire German strategic situation in miniature. Not enough time, not enough resources, not enough anything except courage, and courage was insufficient. The flak crews died. The P-47 seconds flew on. The war continued until material reality forced Germany's surrender. The courage of individual German soldiers, their determination and sacrifice, changed nothing. The mathematics had already determined the outcome. Klaus Dörr simply lived long enough to perform the calculations that proved his own death was inevitable. That is the truth that makes this story worth remembering. Not the heroism or sacrifice, but the futility. The brave men who died defending an impossible position with inadequate weapons against overwhelming force, knowing they would die, dying anyway, accomplishing nothing except adding their names to casualty lists that were already too long to read completely. 8 decades later, the destroyed Flak position outside Chartres has disappeared completely, returned to farmland, no monument marking where 4 young men died in 42 seconds of industrial violence. Klaus Dörr has no grave. His family received notification of his death but never recovered his body. He exists now only in fragmentary records, a name in casualty lists, a data point in statistics about Flak crew losses. But his story, the story of 4 seconds calculated while watching death approach, deserves remembrance precisely because it was not unique. Thousands of German Flak crew members performed identical calculations, reached identical conclusions, died identical deaths. Their courage was real, their determination was absolute, their deaths were inevitable. That is the truth of industrial warfare, the lesson written in blood across French fields in 1944. Courage is not enough. Determination is not enough. When the mathematics are wrong, when material reality dictates outcomes, individual excellence becomes irrelevant. The Americans who killed them were not better soldiers. They were simply better equipped, better supplied, and overwhelmingly more numerous. They won not through superiority of spirit, but through superiority of production. That is not glorious. That is not heroic. That is simply true. And truth, however uncomfortable, deserves acknowledgement. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.